Hello everyone, my name is Vivek and I'm one of the software developers at Postman. I work on a lot of our web-based products, which some of you might have used, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about variables. As it is with pretty much everything related to programming, Postman has variables. Variables in Postman can be used to represent changing data. Now, Postman supports multiple scopes for variables, and understanding these scopes is critical to using variables within Postman. The largest scope is the global scope. If you've been using Postman for a while, the global scope used to apply to the entire app. With the workspaces release though, the global scope refers to a variable which has a value within a particular workspace. You can use globals to store information that doesn't change, but is used repeatedly. For example, if your API requires that you send an employee ID or your name along with every call for some reason, you can use global variables for that. Collection level variables are specific to an individual collection and should be used for information specific to that collection. We also have local variables which exist during the execution of scripts. So if you want to use a variable to hold some information temporarily while your pre-request script or your test script executes, you can use a local variable using var or let. There are also data variables, which I'll get into in a moment, but I'd like to take a moment to talk about environment variables in detail, because they're probably the most commonly used. An environment is a portable scope for your variables. Unlike other scopes, environments can be shared, synced, exported, and so on. Whenever you have data which needs to be moved around a lot or needs to be kept secure, you need to use an environment. So when you're actually using variables within the app, you can use a different syntax depending on where you're using the variable itself. If you're using the variable within a text input, like the URL bar, then you can use the double curly brace syntax. If you're using a variable within the path itself within the URL bar, then you can use the colon variable name syntax. And if you're using a variable within a script or a test, you can use the pm.environment.get API with the variable name. You can also use pm.environment.set to set a value for a variable. So let's look at the collection, a collection that we already have. If you've watched the collections video, you've seen how we build this collection. And you can see that it's probably not the best collection that you can make. It has a lot of repetition and it has a lot of repeated logic that you can just condense into a smaller form so that it's easier to understand. So let's actually look at a request, right? We have this request, which is to list animals everywhere. We have another request for Sydney and so on. And as we just click through these things, we can see that, okay, the region query parameter obviously changes. And that's a perfect example of where we can use a variable. So let's try doing that. Now we're in the URL bar. So what we're going to do is add a region parameter. And instead of hard coding a region, I'm going to use the double curly brace syntax. And I'm just going to write region. Now, you can see that the second I finish typing that, once I have the second double curly brace, the region section of this URL changes color. It turns red. Now, if I hover on it, I can see that, okay, Postman is complaining that we have an unresolved variable. And what that means is we've told Postman that when this request is sent, this part of the URL needs to be replaced with the value of this variable. But we haven't defined a variable, so Postman has no idea what we're referring to. So what we're going to do is we're going to now create an environment and define this variable within that environment. And we're going to do that by going to the top right corner here, where there's a Manage Environments dropdown, which has the gear icon. I'm going to click that, and that is going to open the Manage Environments modal. Now here, I'm going to click on Add to create a new environment, and I will call this new environment Zookeeper Demo Environment. And we're going to create a new variable called region, and for now I'm just going to give it the value Sydney. I'm going to add that, and you can see that at the bottom, Zookeeper Demo Environment is available. Now I can just dismiss this, and I also need to select the environment and set it as the active environment right now. I do that by going to the top right corner where we have the environment dropdown, and I can scroll down and select the environment I just created. And once I do that, you can see that the region part of the URL changes color. It's now orange. And if I hover on it, I can see the resolved value. So the value is Sydney, and the scope that it's being resolved from is the environment. Now, similarly, I can take other parts of this request and use variables for that as well. One example would be I could take this base URL and I can replace that with the variable. It's very probable that I have a beta environment, a staging environment, and a production environment for this. And they're all going to use the same URL structure. The only thing that's going to change is the base URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and replace this using the double curly brace syntax again with a variable called URL. Again, this is red, so I'm going to go ahead and assign a value to that variable by clicking on this eye icon here. This is the environment quick look. I can click on edit, and here I can create a new variable called URL, and I can give it the value. So I update that environment and I dismiss the modal, come back here, and I can see that the value is now resolved. So when this request is sent, it'll actually replace these curly brace sections with the environment values and then send the request. Now, if I keep doing this, if I replace all of the variable parts of my request with actual variables, I'll end up with a collection that looks something like this. So I've also used folders here for better organization. And you can see that, okay, I have 3 endpoints for animals. I can list them. I can add new animals and I can transfer them. And I also have different endpoints for zoos, which do similar things, and for employees. And you can see that if you compare this collection with the one we had before, it's 9 requests versus 30 requests. And this collection actually has way more functionality than the other collection. So we're talking about taking something, taking a collection that could have hundreds of requests and boiling it down into 9 requests, which also communicate the actual functionality of the API. And this is what I would consider to be a good collection. And it's something we could not have done without using variables. So let's go back to presentation. And I mentioned earlier that we have data variables and we also have dynamic variables. We noticed that there are a lot of variables that people reuse very frequently, and we just decided to provide them out of the box. One example of this would be the GUID variable, which you can use using the double curly syntax and $GUID. And what this will do is it will resolve to a random GUID before your request is sent, which means every time you send the request, you'll get a different GUID that you can use. We also have the timestamp variable, which you can use using the double curly brace syntax, $timestamp. And this will resolve to a timestamp representing the time at which the request was sent. And we also have data variables, which are used along with the collection runner. I'm not going to get into the details of that here yet, but it's a great way for you to iterate over a large data set and repeatedly run the same request for different data. So what are the best practices when dealing with variables, or specifically, when should you use environments? As I mentioned earlier, you should use environments when you have data that changes frequently, but still needs to be shared across people. So if you have a collection and it uses, let's say, the URL variable, which represents the base URL, you want that to be shared across everyone in your team. You don't want everyone to create a separate environment for that. So you would simply create an environment and you would share that, and that data is now available to everyone. You can also use environments for sensitive data. So environments are encrypted at rest and at storage, and the environment body itself cannot be accessed by anyone except you. So that means if you have information like API keys or passwords, you should be using an environment to store that. And environments are also used for portable subjective data. So if you have an API that requires any kind of authentication key, perhaps, then you can actually create an environment with just the key for that authentication key, and other people can fill in their own key and use the environment along with the collection. So in summary, variables are used to make better collections. Collections tend to be repetitive if you don't use variables, and using variables or environments can actually help you boil a collection down to its essential parts. Your sensitive data should be stored within environments because environments are the recommended way of storing sensitive information. So you have API keys, passwords, anything else, this information will be safe within an environment. And when you're using variables within your collection or within the Postman app, you need to use the appropriate syntax. You need to use the double curly brace syntax in text inputs. You can use the colon variable name syntax if you're in the URL bar. And if you're within a script, you can use the PM API, PM environment.get or set to work with variables.